Good morning, thrill seekers. And today is going to be a terribly thrilling episode. Terribly thrilling? Anyway, it's going to be thrilling because we're going to talk about what happens after you die. So, little background. Recently, I've been having conversations, online conversations, so, a lot of typing into little chat windows with people I've never actually met, but with two people who are very concerned about dying and what happens after you die and so forth. One of them is actually dying. He's got terminal cancer and he knows he's not going to make it for long, and he's been chatting with me, and it's actually been really pleasant to have these little chats with this guy about his situation. He seems to be taking it remarkably well, considering the circumstances he finds himself in. The other person I don't know that well. He just kind of wrote to me because he was disturbed about the fear of death, and in particular something he read in a Buddhist book, which is what I want to talk about today. So he's been reading a book called The Zen of Living and Dying by Philip Kapleau, but he particularly was disturbed by two sections of the book in which it kind of goes into what happens after you die. And he's kind of like, well, that's not really the Zen tradition, is it? And he's right. It's pretty unusual. To me, the quintessential story about the Zen approach to what happens after you die is the story of Hakuin, who is a Zen master in the Rinzai tradition. And he was asked one time by a student, what happens after you die? And Hakuin said, I don't know. And the student said, what do you mean you don't know? You're a Zen master. And Hakuin said, but I'm not a dead Zen master. So it's pretty much that kind of, in a nutshell, is the usual approach. If you had asked my teacher Gudo Nishijima Roshi when he was alive about life after death, he would say there's no such thing as life after death. When you're dead, you're dead. And if you asked him about reincarnation and rebirth, he would say there's no such thing as reincarnation and rebirth. That was just a story that was taken from Hindu tradition and grafted on to Buddhism later on. Now that's kind of an oversimplification, but that's the way he liked to approach it, I think, because he didn't think that discussions about life after death were conducive to what he wanted to talk about. And in a way, it kind of goes back to something I read when I was trying to study up about how to be a writer, and not Philip K. Dick, my other favorite writer, Kurt Vonnegut, wrote an essay about writing. I wish I could remember the title of it. But in that essay, he said that he never puts a love story in any of his books. And the reason is because as soon as you put a love story in a book, then the reader's attention is drawn to the love story and they don't pay attention to anything else in the book. And I feel like that is often what happens if you talk about life after death. And that's one of the reasons the Zen tradition avoids talking about life after death. But it would be a mistake to kind of blanket say, well, Zen teachers don't believe in life after death, or well, maybe you'd say that. There's a complicated reason behind it. But it's not the same as sort of the atheist view of when you're dead, and it's just nothing after that. It's not quite that. And so this book, The Zen of Living and Dying by Philip Kapleau, he goes into a couple of things, and I'll just read you the bits that the guy who wrote to me online was upset about, and these are kind of edited, but here we go. This is from a chapter called Ego. It says, now let us examine the source of ego from the standpoint of the 9 consciousnesses of Buddhist psychology, which I had mentioned in my discussion about Yogacara, or my various discussions about Yogacara on this channel if you want to go look them up. The first 5 are the root consciousnesses of seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling. So each of our 5 senses, in the way the Westerners figure 5 senses, are called 5 consciousnesses in Buddhist terms. The 6th consciousness is the conceptual faculty that distinguishes and classifies the data of the senses and is what we call the intellect. So they call that a 6th sense. So when they talk about 6th sense, they're not talking about like that movie by M. Night Shyamalan. I don't know how to pronounce that guy's name. Anyway, they're not talking about that. They're talking about intellect as the 6th sense. The 7th root consciousness is the seat of the persistent I awareness and is the source of our value judgments and egoistic opinions, self-centeredness, and illusory notions, all of which give rise to actions in accord with them. It's also called manas, I think. The eighth is the repository or storehouse consciousness, also called alaya vijnana, where the seeds of all mental activity and sense experiences are recorded moment after moment. This consciousness, which persists even after death, retains vestiges of awareness of previous existences and the seeds of new karmic causes. Also to be found on this eighth level are certain memories of the pre-birth condition, feelings of floating or flying, of freedom, of an oceanic awareness with all things. To those sensitively attuned to them, such vestigial memories of the pre-birth period can give a hint of the freedom of the state which we miscall death. The ninth level is pure, formless self-consciousness, our true nature. Self, in that case, self-consciousness is with a large S, so it's not being self-conscious, it's self-consciousness. It is related to the eighth level so intimately that there is almost no difference between the two. It can be compared to a limitless ocean in which each individual life is a wave on the surface. Strictly speaking, ego itself cannot be said to survive death. However, the seventh level of consciousness, the former abode of the I awareness, does persist. It can be likened to a blank sheet of paper, fly paper, lying in wait for the ego's return. In fact, it is the ego's surviving desire for a body and all that it implies that is the propelling force behind rebirth. Or, stated another way, rebirth is the inevitable consequence of our not having attained total liberation in the preceding life. Okay? So that's what he says about ego. The next bit that bothered my correspondent comes from a chapter called The Case for Rebirth. So the chapter title already kind of gives you a sense of what you're going to get. And this is a bit long, so I'm going to read it fast, so here goes. It is the teachings of sages from Buddhist and other cultures that at the moment of death we begin our transitional existence, which is the intermediate realm between death and rebirth. See diagram 4. This realm is very different from the physical plane, but in one respect it is identical. For just as our ego-based perceptions affect the way we relate to and interact with our environment and events in this world, similarly does our karma, stemming from both the last and many former existences, affect the way we relate to the experiences of an intermediate life. There are said to be 3 primary stages of the transitional state. The initial stage consists predominantly of physical sensations of freedom and is relatively short in duration. At this point, a tenuous connection to the physical body still remains. One may be acutely aware of the actions and words as well as the thoughts of living loved ones. This sensitivity and awareness means that any words directed to the deceased at this time, as in chanting for example, can bring about an awakening. The second stage encompasses diverse sensory experiences and lasts longer than the first. In the final stage, the entity is drawn according to its karma to a particular rebirth. The process from death to rebirth is said to take place in cycles of 7 days or multiples thereof, usually 49 days. But this figure is not fixed. It can occur in a day or a week or not until many years later. Presumably, the time of rebirth is determined by, among other factors, the attraction of the being to parents with whom it has a karmic affinity. The 7th, 8th, and 9th levels of consciousness do survive death. At the moment of death, the first 6 levels of consciousness become transmuted from a physical orientation to a non-physical. Until we take on a solid body again, sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and intellect are incipient, functioning in a tenuous way. Without a body as a vehicle, they cannot be fully utilized, but neither are they completely absent. During the first stage, the most striking element is the thought of how easy it is to die. Unlike the sometimes prolonged act of dying, which may be difficult and painful, death itself is as simple, easy, and natural as a leaf's fluttering off a tree. Soon after that, as the intermediate stage of existence is entered, there may be a feeling of floating or flying, similar to the sensations people often have in dreams. There is an awareness of great calmness and tranquility, a sensation of relief and utter ease. The entity may be drawn to a tunnel of bright white light and may sense that loved ones or a wonderful experience lies in wait at the end. The feeling is like that of walking into a lover's embrace or like the joyful anticipation of a child waiting to open presents on Christmas morning. The second stage of passage is deeply influenced by a person's mental state at the time of death. Strong, meaningful chanting at the funeral can be effective. The experience of the second stage varies extensively from person to person. The experiences encountered, however, are all projections of one's own consciousness. And if this is understood and firmly embedded in the mind, one will not be frightened by the apparitions that may appear. And now here we get really colorful. Upon entering the second stage, the intermediate entity may feel confused, as if awakening from a deep, drugged sleep. Everything will seem vaguely familiar and dreamlike, as though the being were caught in a constant state of déjà vu. Many different things may happen now. The senses, which were once accustomed to the simple and mundane things of the physical world, will be assaulted by various frightening, terrible, or exquisitely beautiful sights, sounds, and smells. Loud, startling noises, sudden bangs, cracks, and rumbles will be heard. Howling wind and raging fires may appear. The entity may feel as if it is sinking into an abyss or becoming paralyzed. Words are spoken, but no sound is heard. Sounds are heard, but no words are spoken. Thoughts may wander randomly as in delirium. It is not possible to focus on objects because they move away or become transparent. Nothing seems solid, nothing has substance. It is possible to move like a flash of lightning at great speeds through objects. All of the senses, though of a tenuous nature, are present, but they no longer are attuned to the physical form. When the second stage draws to an end, the third stage begins. As with the first two stages, here too karma plays an all-important role. This is the time when one, so to speak, looks into the mirror of her karma and finds herself committed to a particular course of action. According to the causes and conditions established, the entity will be drawn to one of a number of realms in which rebirth will take place. Okay, so that's pretty interesting stuff. I got some aloe water made by my soon-to-be mother-in-law, so that's nice of her to make that for me. But anyhow, my first question upon reading this is, where does Philip Kapleau get this stuff? Because I've been around Buddhism for 35, 37 years, I don't know how long, and I've read a lot of books and been, pretty immersed in the Zen tradition, and really, there's very little I can think of that's anything like this. The only thing I can think of in the Zen tradition that I know of is Doshin, which is an essay by Dogen, in which he lays out a much more compact version of kind of the same thing. So I assume Doshin was one of his influences, one of Kapleau's influences for writing what he did. And I assume the other big influence is the ever-popular Tibetan Book of the Dead. I've had this book for years, and I still haven't read it, and I think maybe I'm going to read it now to just get myself familiar with what's in there. But the thing that stopped me from reading this the last, 3 times is I get a little bit into it, and I think, well, how do you know this? You're not dead. The people who wrote this weren't dead when they wrote this, so how do they know what happens after you die in such great detail? Maybe I'll address that, but let's leave that question aside for now. So, if you look in the back of Kapleau's book, you'll find a really extensive bibliography, and it gives a hint as to where he got some of these ideas. He cites such books as I think this is an essay, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. It's a fairly famous essay that's out there. Through Death to Rebirth, a book by the Theosophical Society, which the Theosophical Society is really into this kind of esoteric, mystical stuff. Raymond A. Moody's book, Life After Life, which is, what you used to find in supermarkets and things with a kind of a pink cover. Used to see it all the time, never read it, but it's about reincarnation. Let's see, one called Many Lifetimes, one called Many Lives, Many Loves, one called The Case for Reincarnation. So he's been reading a lot of these kind of books, a lot of which are a little dubious. But as to where these guys might have gotten their ideas about reincarnation, meaning the guys who wrote the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the people who wrote it, I don't know if they were men or women, just using guys in a generic context, sorry. Anyway, where they got their ideas, well, let me tell you my own take on the thing. I've been doing this Buddhist stuff for many years, doing lots of meditation, and my main meditation is twice a day. I get up in the morning, I do zazen. I do zazen before going to bed. Sometimes I do some in the middle of the day when I've got time. So 2 or 3 times a day for the past 35 or so years, or 37 years, or however long it's been. So that's a lot of meditation, but it's not nearly as much as the people who compiled the Tibetan Book of the Dead, who were ensconced in monasteries up in the mountains of Tibet for, just doing meditation all day long, all night long sometimes. And so given some of my experiences around Zazen and some of the things that have played out, and extrapolating from that, I could give credence to the idea that if one got deeply into that stuff enough, one might get some insight into what happens after you die. It doesn't seem impossible to me. And I would think, if I'm going to listen to anybody's opinions about what happens after you die, who are living people, I would think monks who've been meditating a whole lot would be the ones I'd listen to more than, I don't know, the preacher down the street who talks about fire and brimstone and hell because he read it in a book. This is actually from something like real experience. And I've also understood through my practice and through some of the experiences I've had that really birth and death are kind of an illusion, at least the way we normally think of them. There is no such thing as birth in the sense that we think of it as just suddenly coming into existence one day from not being existing at all, and death, which is suddenly disappearing from existence forever after having existed. It doesn't make sense if you kind of start to understand how things are. So I do think that maybe there is some reason to trust what Kapleau has written, although I think some of the details he's cribbing from books that I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in. But, I'm not saying that it's completely bunk. But the question becomes, like, why worry about this? And I guess the answer, I would say, is depends on your situation. The most important thing we are doing in Zen practice is learning to focus on right here, right now, just as it is, and understanding that. And death, as long as you're a living person, is always something in the future. I guess if you believe in reincarnation, maybe death is something in the past, but in any case, it's removed from the now. So it's either in the future, which I think everybody agrees on, or as some people in the Buddhist and other traditions agree on, it's in the past in the sense of reincarnation, but it's not now. This is the moment. And Dogen has something nice to say in one of his essays, which he says, the moment of death is the moment of death, fully and completely just as it is. And living, a moment of living is a moment of living, fully and completely just as it is, without going into a lot of speculation about what happens next and so forth. But on the other hand, maybe there is some value to this, because I think people who have a kind of a sense of something beyond this life, which I know I just went on to say that there's nothing beyond this life, but I'm kind of using the words differently now. Something that is bigger than what we think of as this life, the kind of meat machine thing that's going to live until it dies and just has a function to try to gain as much as it can in this life and enjoy it as much as it can and then go away forever. People who have a view that's bigger than that tend to have a better response to a lot of things in life and tend to live life more fully. So, I think there may be some value in talking about things like this, but I also think it's important that we don't make it into a belief system. Nobody's saying, or at least I'm not saying, that you have to believe this. I just offer it as, here's an example of something that's out there that's kind of interesting to me. But I don't offer it as, this is what happens after you die, and you better believe it. That's kind of the message I got from churches I went to and from the Hare Krishna movement I went to before I got into Zen. And I found that really was problematic because I couldn't believe what they said happens after you die. And in the case of Zen, what I liked about it is they don't insist you believe on anything. But if you dig into the tradition enough, you will find stuff like this. And I think that's also important because a lot of people who approach it in the West are kind of surprised when they get there and find stuff similar to this, or when they come across Doshin in Shogo Genzo and things like this, where he goes into what happens after you die. It does exist and it is part of the tradition. It's just not something we emphasize very much. I don't know if I succeeded in explaining anything about that, but it was interesting for me to make the video, so I hope you liked it. If you want to donate to me, somebody was in the comments the other day just complaining about me asking for donations. Well, if it was the only way you made a living was from people donating to your YouTube channel, you'd be asking for donations too. So that's why I'm doing it, because it's my only way of making a living. But if you're having financial trouble, as I always say, don't get annoyed by me asking for donations. Just don't donate. It's up to you. I offer this for free, and if you want to donate, that's your business, and I really appreciate it if you do, but I'm not requiring it. Anyway, that's the deal, and I want to thank you for watching, and have a good time all the time. See you later. Bye. How you doing, Ziggy? Is your Gammy back? Did she give you treats? I think she did. You're licking your lips like she did. You look happy. She gonna give you more treats?